Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I should say. We just hit that noon mark. I'm going to give everybody a moment to file into our virtual training room. Get settled, grab yourself some water, some snacks before we get started into hiring right the first time. All right, I think we've got most people now. So thank you for joining us today. Welcome Central Valley Hotline users. My name is Stephanie Neely. I'm the Marketing Director here at California Employers Association. Before we start today's webinar, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping details with you. The handouts for this presentation were attached to the login reminder that you received last night and this morning. If you didn't receive those, please let me know in the chat box and I will make sure you get a copy of those. Throughout the presentation, your audio will be muted, which means you can hear us, but we can't hear you and you can't hear each other. If you have any questions about the content in the presentation, please use the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. It's the icon with 2 speech bubbles, and Mary will try to get through those as we go throughout the presentation. She'll either type in an answer or answer them live for everybody to hear. If you have any other questions, technical difficulties, that sort of thing, please let me know in the chat box. That's the one with the single speech bubble, and I will help you figure it out and we'll get everything working. Because your feedback is very important to us, please fill out the survey that will pop up at the end of this webinar. It provides us with valuable feedback that we use to constantly improve our presentations. Your speaker today is Miss Mary Bradford. She's one of our rockstar HR directors here. And with that, I'm going to pass this over to Mary.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Appreciate it. And welcome, everybody. Really glad to have you with us today. We have a big room full of people who want to hear all about hiring right the first time. So you're in the right place. That's what we're going to chat about today. And I'm sure you saw from the handouts that we have some other good things to talk about as well. So let's start with one of our most important slides, and this is the hotline resource phone number slide that you want to make sure you jot down the HR hotline for your area. So we have this Central Valley County group that's got together to provide this amazing hotline to you. All of these counties partnered to provide this Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 hotline. When you call one of these numbers, again, just make sure you call the number that's for your county. You are going to be connected with one of the HR support team advisors. I'm just one of 7 people that answer the phone, and we are happy to help you with any HR related question you have. If it is about hiring, for example, or if it's about a leave of absence, if it's about an overtime issue, if you have questions on harassment prevention, we are happy to help you with all of those. And that is provided free of charge to you. So there's no cost to you to call. It's a wonderful resource. And so do make sure anytime you have questions, just give us a ring. If you're the HR person and you want to get a second opinion, you want to talk to another HR person and bounce some ideas off of us, we're happy to do that. If you're the owner, give us a call. If you're a manager, happy to chat with you about anything that's going on. So do make sure you put down the number for your county and then just give us a call anytime you have questions. So if you're not familiar with CEA, we are the California Employers Association. We are based in Sacramento, but we all are all over the state. We have lots of members and lots of partners that we work with in the Central Valley. So we are in your area all the time, and we know all of the challenges that you are facing. We know how difficult it's been to run a business for the past couple of years with all the changes and regulations and everything you've had to deal with. So our goal at CEA is to bring you peace of mind. So if we do that through the hotline, fantastic. If you find that you need a little more help, maybe you need someone to come on site to help you with a project or an employee issue, maybe you need some help with a customized handbook, we can help you with that too. So just we've got our main number on all of the slides, but again, you've got your county number to call for that specific hotline. But I encourage everybody, take a look at our website, which is employers.org. We have so many great resources out there for you. Some are member only, and I'll talk about that at the end if you find you need a little more assistance. But we've got lots of free resources out there that you can take advantage of. I always encourage you sign up for our newsletter so you can read our blogs, get our weekly updates when there are any changes that you need to know about. The last disclosure, and then we'll get into the good stuff. CEA is not a law firm. So when you call, we're not going to give you legal advice. We're going to talk about some of the laws and the regulations and all of those kind of good things, but we are not attorneys and we're not your attorney. So anytime you have a matter of significance where you think, gosh, I really need a good legal opinion, that's when you want to get in touch with an attorney. We do have some great partners we work with. We're happy to refer you out to them if you need that. But it is always a good idea because we are California. Make sure you have an attorney you can contact if you ever need to. All right, here's our agenda today. We're going to talk about the different types of employees or people that might be working for you. We're going to talk about advertising your job, screening applications, and how very important that is to save you some time. It's kind of your best tips for conducting a successful interview, what you want to do when it comes time to make that job offer, and then when you start that relationship off on the right foot and why that's so important to really set everybody up for a successful employment relationship. And then I also threw in some slides because I kind of want to go over some wage and hour requirements in California because that's so important as you start off on the right foot that we make sure that we are paying our employees properly and we have them classified properly. And that will hopefully keep you out of hot water in the long run too. So let's start talking about how do we determine what we need? This is what we have to take a look at now. And I know our workforce is always changing, and especially if you have a lot of seasonal workers, maybe there's certain times of the year where you need a lot more employees and certain times of the year where you don't need that many employees. So we have to figure out, do we need someone on a temporary basis or do we see that we're going to need them kind of for the long term? Now, are we thinking about bringing in an independent contractor? Our next slide is going to tell you why you have to be so careful about bringing in independent contractors in California, but sometimes they might work for your business depending on the situation. Do we need someone who's going to be full-time or part-time? Do we need someone for 1 day a week, or do we need somebody who's going to be there 5 days a week? Are they going to be exempt or non-exempt? So exempt means that somebody receives a flat salary regardless of how many hours they work. But in order to be classified as exempt, there are salary minimum requirements they must meet, as well as a duties test. And we're going to talk about that later on. A non-exempt employee, those are our hourly employees, and that is what everybody defaults to in California. You just default to being a non-exempt hourly employee. It's always up to the business to prove that somebody is not that they're either exempt or they're an independent contractor or they're something else. And then we have to take a look at what level is this person? What kind of skill set are we looking for? Is this someone who's just starting out from high school and they're looking for an entry-level job? Or do we need somebody that has 5 to 10 years of experience in a particular position? And what about their educational background? Are we going to require a degree? Is that really necessary for this position? I'm sure as many of you have probably noticed if you've been doing recruiting, degrees aren't always as important as they used to be. That kind of used to be a benchmark that you had to have a degree. And now a lot of times people have a lot of experience without necessarily having a degree, and they might be just as qualified for the position. So you might want to take a look at being more flexible when it comes to degrees these days. And then we have to take a look at physical abilities. Is this a particular position where a person needs to be able to lift or push or pull a certain amount of weight in order to meet the minimum requirements for this job? So we should take a look at that, make sure we address that in our job description, our ad, as well as our interviews. And then we need to take a look, are we going to employ minors? Do we have a position where maybe it's a restaurant that you own or you're a franchisee for a particular chain? So you might be bringing in someone under 18. We've got a couple of considerations there. Now, when it comes to minors, one of the things I will tell you now that you have to keep in mind, of course, you always have to make sure that you have a work permit anytime that you're employing minors, but also any of your supervisors or any individuals that have supervisory responsibility over a minor, so somebody that would help hire, direct, promote, demote, any of those kind of things. They're also required now to have mandated reporter training in California. So if you employ minors, any of your supervisors need to have mandated reporter training. CEA does offer that, so you can give us a call at the hotline. We'll be happy to fill you in. And for those of you that are CEA members, I know we have a bunch on the line today. We do have one of our new toolkits, which is one of your benefits of membership. We have an Employ Minors toolkit that takes you step by step through that whole process. It has all the links to the form, so it's all in one concise place. So check that out if that is something that you need. So let's talk about independent contractors. This has been one of those issues that has really been all over the place in California. If you've been dealing with independent contractors for a while, you probably remember something called the Borello test, which used to be the standard for many, many years. There were about 7 questions. You would take a look at those 7 questions, and if it was weighted more heavily that yes, this person met most of these 7 questions, then you could say, all right, they're an independent contractor. I feel comfortable with that. But the Borello test is now in the background. You can still default to it, but the number 1 test that you want to use is this ABC test. So this is a decision that the Supreme Court of California came out with, saying this is the test that we want employers to use to determine if somebody is an independent contractor. And the rule is the individual needs to meet all 3 of these examples that I have, all of A, B, and C. It can't be they meet B and C or A and C. They have to meet all 3 of them. So an individual needs to be free from control and direction of the hirer. They need to perform work that is outside the usual course of business of the hiring entity, and they need to be engaged in that trade. So they need to be working for other people doing the same thing. So, for example, if you are a doctor's office and you need to have a plumber come in, and that plumber says, I want you to 1099 me. That would probably be a condition where you could do a 1099 to someone because they're a plumber. You have nothing to do with plumbing in your office. That's outside of your normal course of business. But anytime you want to classify someone as an independent contractor now, we do recommend that you consult with counsel because it is so confusing out there. There are lots of exceptions that have been put into place for different industries, different groups, mostly those that had very strong lobbies and were able to get them excluded from this ABC test. So anytime you're tempted to 1099 someone, we just recommend consult with counsel, run it past them, make sure that they give you their stamp of approval, and then you can move forward with it. Now, as I mentioned before, you always want to take a look at exempt and non-exempt. Remember, in California, everyone defaults to non-exempt employees. So they are paid for every single minute that they are working for you. When it comes to exempt employees, they need to do 2 things. They have this salary level that they have to meet, and then they have a duties level that they have to meet. So when it comes to that salary test, that's based on our California minimum wage, which right now, for an exempt employee, they need to be paid $64,480 as their base salary every year. And they are paid at least that regardless of how many hours they work. When they are exempt, then they are exempt from a lot of the wage and hour laws. So you don't have to worry about overtime. They don't need to take their rest and their meal breaks. There's a lot fewer compliance issues, but again, the burden is on the employer to show that that person should be exempt and receive that salary. Now, when it comes to non-exempt, that's a little easier to manage. That just means we're paying them for every moment they work for us. All those overtime laws apply. So if they work more than 8 hours in a day, they're getting overtime. If they work more than 40 in the work week, they're getting overtime. They get their meal and their rest periods. And we're going to have very good records of our individuals and their hours. So we show clock in, we show clock out for lunch, we show clock back in from lunch, and then clock out at the end of the day. So you want to make sure you have very good timekeeping records for all of your non-exempt employees as well. But let's talk about some of those exemptions when it comes to those white collar exemptions, as they're sometimes known, or in order to classify somebody as exempt. So there's 3 different categories. There is executive, which means that individual is managing 2 or more full-time employees in a particular group. We have an administrative exemption. That means that somebody who's working directly with management, they're very involved in the business operations. And then we have a professional. This is an individual that has a degree, some sort of license or certificate in a specific field. So this is where teachers fall under that. Accountants would fall under this as well. So that's some of those areas there. Now, we have to make sure, though, that we don't go off of titles when we're looking at these exemptions. We have to say, okay, they're an office manager, doesn't necessarily mean they're exempt because the word manager is in their title, or just because they're a lead or a supervisor. Titles don't designate if an employee is exempt or non-exempt. It really comes down to this duties test. So 51% or more of their time needs to be spent on these administrative, professional, or executive tasks. Do they have a lot of independent discretion and judgment? Are they making a lot of decisions on their own? Are they pretty self-sufficient? If this is somebody who is being micromanaged all the time, that you're really watching everything they do and giving them a lot of direction at all times, they're probably not going to meet that exemption qualification. But what we do recommend you do is for any position that you want to classify as exempt, you want to do a worksheet for that particular position. We have them on the CEA website. There's administrative, professional, managerial, so you can see which category might work for your employee depending on what they do for you. But remember, the burden's on you as the employer to prove that that person or that position should be classified as exempt. So it's worth doing your due diligence on that, just in case it's ever questioned. So here's our slide showing you that exempt salary that I just mentioned, that $64,480. And then on the left, that's where you will see our non-exempt hourly rate. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, wait, I thought we were supposed to be at $15 an hour. Well, we were, but then we had that pesky inflation come up, and there is a provision in the state law that says if inflation is over 7%, then minimum wage has to be adjusted up. So instead of being at that 15 hour we were waiting for everyone to be at, everyone is now at a minimum of $15.50. So do make sure that your employees are always making $15.50 an hour as a non-exempt employee. Now, how we come up with that exempt salary is that's actually based on the state minimum wage. So they take the state minimum wage, they multiply it by 2, they multiply it by 2080, and that gives you the salary requirement for an exempt employee. Now, if some of you are sitting there thinking, wait a minute, I wanted to call this position that I'm about to hire exempt, but I'm only going to pay them $55,000 a year, or maybe I have people in this position already and I can't bump them up to $64,480. That's where you want to take a step back and say, okay, here are my options. I either pay them a much higher salary than they're currently at, so I get to that minimum threshold, or I need to take a look at transitioning that employee from exempt to non-exempt. I can assure you, so many businesses have been doing this over the past few months as soon as they announce this big jump. Because as you might recall, in years past, the minimum wage was based on employer size. So if you were a smaller employer, you were paying a little less than a larger employer, which was considered if you had 26 or more employees. For smaller employers last year, the minimum wage for a salaried employee was only around $58,000. So when it went up to 64, it was a huge jump. It was almost a $7,000 jump. And that's a big salary increase to give someone if they're maybe not in the position to do that. So that's where a lot of employers started transitioning their employees from exempt to non-exempt. And we do have a couple of tips on that. If that's something you need to do, because remember, when someone changes down to a non-exempt employee, they need to follow all of those rules. So they're taking their rest breaks and their meal breaks, they're clocking in and out, and sometimes you just have to retrain everybody because they forget how to do that when they've been an exempt employee. So do make sure you've got your employees classified correctly. And as you go to hire a position, you want to make sure you're telling the individuals who are applying what kind of position it is, so you can make sure that everybody's on the same page, because misclassification in California, it gets very, very expensive. So on the bottom of this slide, we have a little bit.ly link for you that takes you to some of those tips if you do need to change someone from non-exempt to, or excuse me, from exempt to non-exempt. And remember, you're always safer doing it that way. So when in doubt, we always recommend you bring them down to that level. Now, when it comes to minimum wage, the other thing you need to remember when you're trying to determine how much you want to pay your new hire is there are over 35 different local minimum wage ordinances in California. Now, the Central Valley has been fairly protected from that, which has been great. You default to the state minimum wage, but keep in mind where your employee will be working is the minimum wage you want to look at. So you might be based in Fresno, but if you hire an employee who's going to be working in Los Angeles, or if they're going to be working in Emeryville, you need to make sure that you are paying the minimum wage for that particular city where the individual is working. Now, the good news, when it comes to exempt employees, their wage doesn't change based on geographic location. So exempt employees, regardless of where they are based, are always at that $64,480 as a minimum. So you don't have to worry about local wage ordinances with that, which is very handy. But do keep in mind, if you're paying employees minimum wage, if you've got multiple locations in different cities, make sure you're checking on that local minimum wage. And we do have another bit.ly for you there. It also includes information on paid sick leave, because we do have, I believe it's 7 or 8 cities that have their own paid sick leave ordinances in California. So make sure you're checking in on those, just so you're being compliant with that. And again, that's where that employee is physically working, where you want to make sure you're paying that correct minimum wage and giving them any extra PSL benefits that they might be entitled to. Now, the last thing to keep in mind, if you are hiring someone for a computer professional position, or for physician or surgeon, they have their own minimum wage requirements for California. These are adjusted every year. Right now, physicians need to be paid at least $97.99 per hour. If they are paid less than that, then they do not meet that exemption. Same thing for computer professional softwares. They need to be paid over $112,065.20, which is $53.80 an hour. So they have to be at those minimum thresholds in order to be considered exempt. If you're paying someone less than that, make sure you classify them as a non-exempt hourly employee. We see that happen a lot in the IT world. Someone will say, oh, it's an IT tech and they're making $70,000. They're so great at what they do. We're just going to make them exempt, but that would not meet that minimum qualification. So be very, very cautious with that and take a look at that as you start to look at placing the ads for jobs. You want to make sure you have everything classified correctly. So let's talk about advertising your job opening. Now that we know how much we're going to need to pay our employees, we really want to take a look at our job postings and make sure they really accurately represent what you're looking for in a position. You want to talk about job responsibilities, expectations, any of those physical requirements that someone might have to do. What are the essential functions? What does somebody absolutely have to do in this position? Now, of course, with every position, there's other duties as assigned, but you want to make sure you're very clear on what are the core responsibilities this individual has to do. This is also where you can put in if it's an exempt or non-exempt position. Now that you know how to properly classify those individuals, you're going to talk about who they report into. You know, is this an HR position that reports into the CFO, or is this an HR position that reports into the vice president in another state? You can kind of give a little information so people know how the structure of a position will be. You can talk about work days. You can talk about work hours, just so it's very clear what this individual needs to expect in this position, because you don't want to have a lot of people applying that can't work on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and you absolutely need someone on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. So you want to be very clear what the expectations are for this job. Now, the other big change for 2023, there is a new law that requires employers, if you have 15 or more employees, you need to post the salary range in your job posting. So if the position is posted to work in California, or if somebody could do the job from California, if you're possibly located out of state, then you have to make sure it has that salary range. Now, that range is the range that somebody in that position could be paid. So maybe you're looking at an IT tech, for example. So maybe the range for that position is between $30 and $40 an hour. Maybe your average that you pay your employees is $35 an hour, but the range based on experience, education, et cetera, is between 30 and 40 an hour. So again, if you have 15 or more employees, you are now required to include that in your job posting. So make sure you have those in there. Now, when it comes time to advertise a position, there's so many options. I remember when I worked for a software company before I worked for CEA, and we would post a lot of our jobs. We're based up in Rockland, California, but we tried to pull people out of the Bay Area because they had so many good engineers. And I would post a job posting in the San Jose Mercury News. It was a 1-inch by 2-inch ad, and it cost $1,500 to post, which makes me laugh to this day. But there's so many options for posting jobs now that are considerably less expensive than that. And you very seldom see jobs like that posted anymore. So a couple of things to take a look at. You can advertise internally. It's a great way to get some candidates because, you know, normally people won't bring you a poor performer for a position in the company. They're going to bring people that they know are going to show up and know how to do the job, somebody that they would recommend. That's a great way. You can even put in a referral program where you say, if you refer someone who we hire and you're both here 6 months later, we give you $100 or $500 or whatever kind of bonus might work for your company. You can do some nice incentives. And of course, advancing from within, you can encourage your own employees to apply for a new job. Maybe somebody's been looking for a change of pace. They want to do something different, but they want to stay with your organization. Maybe they're looking to move up in the organization. There's lots of good opportunities for you there. And then, of course, advertising externally. LinkedIn, ZipRecruiter, Indeed. There's so many places you can post a job now. It's a great opportunity for you. Of course, we've got America's Job Centers, you've got Workforce Development Boards, you've got EDD. So there are really a lot of opportunities for you to have a job posted in a bunch of different places without a lot of cost. So there's lots of good options for you there. And again, for our CEA members, we do have a really nice toolkit that we have put together to help you kind of step by step on all these hiring things. And we had a question come in. What if a position does not have a range? It's just a flat hourly amount that is included in the job posting. So the question is that okay? That is okay if only everyone in that position is paid that amount. So if it's just this position is minimum wage, it's $15.50 and that's all we pay, that's perfectly fine. But if you think there might be a range, you could put $15.50 to $16.50 or $17 or something like that. If people within that particular position might have a little bit of flexibility. But if you truly just have one pay rate that everybody is paid for a particular position, yes, you can just put the pay rate for this position is $15.50 an hour. So that's a great question. Thank you. All right, so let's take a look at screening applications. This is a big process, as we all know, and this is where everybody kind of takes a breath like, whew, it's going to be a lot of work. But that's okay, we can do it, not to worry. When we go through that recruitment process, we're going to look at taking care of all these steps. Obviously, we post that ad. We're going to screen the resumes. Here's a great tip that I would recommend. Once you screen those resumes and you say, all right, I've got these 10 people I'm interested in, here's what you can do. Send them an application and say, submit this application back to me within 48 hours. See what you get back, because that's a nice way to find out, are people paying attention? Are people proactively going to fill out this application and get it back to me as quickly as possible? Or are they not paying attention? Or did they just throw out a resume and they don't really care if they apply to this job or not? That can be a really nice initial screening when you send that application and see what you get back. Then once you get your applications back, which by the way, when it comes to applications, make sure you're always using a California compliant application. And I'm going to talk a little more about that in just a second. But then you're going to conduct some of those screening interviews. That might be over the phone. It might be over Zoom. Then when you get your list whittled down a little more, you've got your on-site interviews, and then you're going to make your reference checks or do your reference checks, and then you can make your offer. So let me kind of break these down. We're going to talk a little more about these in detail here. So when it comes to employment applications, we recommend you have your employees or your applicants do applications, because resumes can be really nice and pretty. An application is more of a legally binding document because an individual is signing off, attesting that the information is accurate. Look at those applications carefully. Does it match the resume? Is it close? Does it seem like this is the same person that you met over their resume? See if it's an actual accurate representation of that individual. Also, when it comes to applications in California, you can no longer have salary information or conviction questions. So remove anything that says, have you ever been convicted of a misdemeanor or a felony? Tell me all about it, or ask for salary information. Remove all of that from your applications immediately. It should not be on there. And applications really can be a little more telling than a resume. There's normally more details that you're asking on applications. You're asking for references. You're getting a little more specific detail on how long they worked at a place or who they worked for. So we really encourage you to use applications. It works out much better, we find. A couple of red flags to look out for. People that don't sign it, that's a red flag. Missing information. Oh, I can't remember my supervisor I worked for 6 months ago. How can you not remember your supervisor you worked for 6 months ago? It's probably because they don't want you to contact them. Do they have a lot of misspellings? Are there a lot of mistakes? You just kind of want to look at an overall picture of how does that individual complete that application. Again, did they do it in a timely manner? Did they respond back to your request for an application? Did they give you all of that info that you were looking for? All right, ooh, we had a couple of application questions come in. Do you recommend getting the application prior to the interview? I personally think it's not a bad idea to have an application filled out before an interview, because then it's nice to be able to check between the resume and the application to see again if they match, if that's the real person you want to talk to. And then you can bring them in and you can still reference that application. But if you would rather just have them fill out an application when they come into interview, that's perfectly fine too, totally up to you. What about if in order to hire someone, they cannot have felonies? We're going to talk about that in just a second. And we're working with school districts. Can we hire people after they had time? Oh, great question. I would recommend you check in with the school district. Certain districts, county and state agencies, I believe, have different guidelines for that. So I would check with that, and when in doubt, consult with counsel. It's great questions, everybody. All right, interview awareness. When that individual comes into interview, How did they look? How did they show up? Did they seem like they were pulled together? Did they get lost? Were they late? How were they in answering those questions? Did they seem as if they had very practiced questions, as if they might be a professional interviewer, which there are some out there. So be careful of those people. They interview great, but they don't know what they're talking about. Take a look at, did they provide some information that gave you a little bit of an insight into who they were? And that's why we also encourage you to ask a lot of behavioral questions. Did they, you want to ask them how they dealt with situations. How did they deal with stress? Tell me about a time you had to calm a customer down who was upset. Tell me about a time when there was conflict in the workplace between another employee. How did you work that out? You want to kind of get those questions and see if you can get a little more from that person as to who they are, besides just, do you know Microsoft Word or can you do Excel? So we want to find out a little more about that person. So that's why we kind of want to take a look at really how they behave and how they appear and how they present themselves. And really, how did they handle a lot of those questions that you were asking them? Did they seem like they were coming up with random answers that maybe didn't apply? Or were they a little more pulled together, but not super rehearsed? That's kind of that professional interviewer we have there at the bottom of the slide. Some people just interview. It's just what they do. And that's great for them, but probably not so good for you. So sometimes you have to go a little deeper on some of those interview questions and get a little more information to find out really more about that person. Who are they really? Now, here are a couple things you do not want to ask in an interview. Do not ask about protected classifications. There are almost 20 protected classifications in California right now. So we don't want to ask somebody's age. We don't want to ask if they have kids. We don't want to ask if they own a car. We don't want to ask what their religion is. We don't want to ask any of those questions. We don't want to ask about criminal history, as I mentioned, and we don't want to ask about salary history. Now, we can start getting a little deeper into some of those things after we make an offer, which I'll tell you about in just a second. But don't make the mistake of in an interview saying, yeah, were you ever arrested? Were you ever convicted of a felony? That's not what you're looking at right now. When you have an individual that you're interviewing for a position, you're looking at, is this individual qualified for the job? So you want to take a look at objective factors, skills, experience, background, education. That's what we want to take a look at. We don't want to ask any of those personal questions. You can ask those questions later on after they're hired if individuals want to share that information, but we don't want to say, do you ever have childcare issues? I noticed you're not wearing a wedding ring. Are you divorced? Are you widowed? We don't want to ask any of those questions. So be very, very cautious with that. Now, I mentioned before, salary questions are off the table. So make sure you don't have any salary history information on your application, and make sure you are not asking for salary history information in the interview. So as a reminder, if you're a larger employer, 15 or more, you're required to post the range for that position. I would actually encourage you, even if you have less than 15 employees, go ahead and put that range in there. I think it's a great thing because it does help kind of weed out some of those candidates that just can't work for a particular range, or they're just thinking like, oh gosh, I really need $25 an hour. They're only paying 22. I don't think that's the right position for me. So I think it can help save you some time and figure out that information. But when you're in the interview, you can say the range for this position is between $25 and $30 an hour. Does that meet your qualifications? And leave it at that. But we don't want to ask history. The reason why is they don't want an employer asking somebody, how much did you used to make? Maybe somebody says $22 an hour. Your range is 25 to 30. And you think, oh, well, we pay 25 to 30, but I'm going to pay them 22. They seem happy with that. So that's why they really want to make sure that there's that kind of that Equal Pay Act that's been going on in California, making sure that decisions are more objective and not based on salary information. It's based on what you as an employer pay for that position. So be really cautious with that. Now, an employee could, or excuse me, an applicant could voluntarily disclose, I really need to make over $50,000 a year. That's perfectly fine. But you just want to make sure you as an employer aren't asking any of those history related questions. Okay, does asking if they have reliable transportation, is that allowed? Yes, that is allowed. Great question. But you don't want to say, do you own a car? You just want to say, do you have reliable transportation? Or you can say, this position, you're required to be here from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. every day. Is there any reason you wouldn't be able to make those hours work? That's an okay question to ask, but you just don't want to say, do you have a car? Or do you have enough money that you can afford a car and insurance? that's nothing that you need to be concerned about. All you need to be concerned about as an employer is this position is from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Can you work those hours? Perfectly fine to ask those questions. Are we allowed to give integrity tests, and where can we get the best one? So we have to be really cautious with some of the tests that are out there. Really what you want to do are skill-based tests. CEA doesn't have anything along those lines because we're not recruiters. We don't do too much with that. But you might want to take a look at a local temporary agency. They might have some skill-based tests that could assist you, but be very cautious. Remember, we don't want to ask any questions that fall into those protected categories. Sometimes some of those integrity or personality tests can go a little too personal and they start to cross the line into some of those protected categories in California. So just make sure it's a California compliant test if you want to do something like that. Skill-based are much safer because they're more objective as opposed to some of those integrity or personality tests. So just be cautious with them. Some of them are perfectly fine, but I wouldn't get anything from out of state because they probably don't know all of our requirements in California. All right, so let's talk about once you've found your candidate and you decide, I want to offer them a position. Okay, so negotiations are pretty big right now, as you've probably dealt with. And when we've got a tight labor market, when it is hard to find good people, you might have to be a little flexible in some of your positions. So what you need to know is the market for your particular location, for your particular industry. And this is where compensation surveys might come into play and might be helpful for you. If you're part of a particular industry that might have an association that does a salary survey, that's a great resource. If you're in manufacturing, for example. If you need some more individualized assessments, we do have a partner at CEA that we work with that does compensation analysis, and they can help you with that. But really, one of the things you want to remember is when you're presenting someone with an offer, I recommend you tell them the entire package that they're going to receive. Sometimes employers will just say, well, this position is $25 an hour. But if you offer vacation benefits, that has a value because that's a wage, that's considered a value. If you offer a 401k match, if you offer medical benefits, if you offer other paid time off, I would kind of put together the whole package so that you can show them, because if they're comparing you between another company, say you're both paying $35,000 a year, one company only pays $35,000, you pay $35,000, but you have 7 paid holidays and you give them a week of vacation after a year, that's going to be a little more appealing. So take a look at that entire compensation package that you give them when you're offering, because sometimes that can really help somebody make a decision. And again, just be prepared to negotiate, know really what your range is, what you can do as an employer, and because a lot of these decisions have to be made very quickly. As you know, with a tight labor market, when you find a good candidate, you kind of want to secure them as quickly as you can, because if you don't, somebody else will. So make sure you're trying to be really proactive with that. Now, when it comes to reference checks, we always recommend that you do reference checks. At a minimum, call the people that they list on the application. Sometimes they can be friends, but I always recommend you clarify during the interview, are these professional references or are these personal references? Ideally, you want to talk to somebody that they used to work with. Now, if somebody is currently employed, they're probably not going to want you to call their supervisor if their supervisor doesn't know that they are looking for a job. But that doesn't mean that you can't ask them for a name of a coworker that they currently work with, or maybe a supervisor that they used to work with who's no longer with their current company that you could talk to. So there's normally a couple of options for you there. When it comes to background checks, we always recommend a background check whenever possible. Companies can choose if they want to do a 5 or 7 year background check. But remember, and I'll talk about this here in just a second, you can only do a background check post-offer. So you can't do that before you've made an offer for an individual. When it comes to driver's license, you can do that if it's required for the job. Remember, we only want to do things that are required for the job. And you as an employer are going to be paying for these tests. You can't require an employee to incur any cost as part of that application process. And when you're looking at reference checks and deciding, or excuse me, background checks, you can decide, do I really need a background check for this position? If it's somebody who's handling cash, going into people's homes, going to be working unsupervised, that might lean more towards maybe getting a background check. You never know. So you really have to weigh all the different components of the particular position that you're sourcing for. Let's see, we had another question come in. What if I pay for mileage and drive time? Can you ask about car insurance? Yes. So if a particular position is a driving position, what you can say is, in this position, you're required to use a personal vehicle and you would have to be insured and show proof of insurance in order to meet the requirements of this position. So yes, you could do that if that is, again, a requirement for the job. But again, you just don't want to say, do you own your own car? Because if somebody can borrow somebody's car, as long as they have proof of insurance, if they are insurable, or if they co-own a car with somebody, that's what you have to look into. So you just have to make sure that they have a car and that they have proof of insurance, that they are insured for a vehicle, if that's a requirement of your job. Now, when it comes to criminal history, ban the box. If you have 5 or more employees, then you can't ask anything about criminal convictions on job applications. If you have less than 5 employees, I would still be very, very cautious about doing that in California. So again, you can't ask any of those questions about criminal history until after a conditional offer is made. When it comes to needing to rescind an offer, if you get a criminal check and you decide this is not the person I want in the position, keep in mind you can't have an automatic rule that says if you've had a felony conviction or misdemeanor in the past 7 years, you're automatically eliminated as an applicant. That's not allowed in California. What you as an employer would have to show is this particular conviction has a direct and adverse impact on this particular job. So for example, you're hiring someone to be a driver and you do your background check and it comes back that they had a DUI 6 months ago. That would probably be a pretty red flag that would not be an appropriate person to have as a driver. But if you deny employment based on that conviction history, there are many steps that you have to go through. And we do have a fact sheet on our website that takes you kind of step by step through that. But the quick overview is you have to provide the information to the applicant as to why you want to rescind the offer. You have to provide a copy of that conviction report, and they have 5 days to respond because there are mistakes that are made, things happen. So they have 5 days to respond. If you still decide after 5 days to deny employment, you have to give them another letter that contains information that they can contact the Department of Civil Rights if they disagree with this ruling. So there's several steps you have to go through. So make sure you don't just automatically disqualify someone because you learn that they have a conviction. You have to, again, make sure, is it directly tied to that job? So be very careful with that. So again, post-offer pre-employment testing. So when it comes to any of this testing, you want to make sure it's conditional offer, and that's what you can say. This offer is conditional upon you successfully passing a background check as well as a pre-employment drug screen. So make sure, and this, I don't hear about this happening as much anymore, but polygraph tests. Polygraph tests, unless they're required by law, which you might be in an industry that does that, that's the only time you can do that. So you can't subject the majority of employees to a polygraph test. As we talked about, psychological tests, be careful with those. Again, skill-based testing is your safest bet when it comes to analyzing your applicants. And marijuana. If you joined us for our labor law update, I'm sure you heard about the changes coming in 2024 about more protections for marijuana use. Some employers have already decided to take marijuana out of the pre-employment drug testing as one of the categories. That is completely up to you at this point. Remember, in California, employees can still not be under the influence of marijuana or alcohol or any controlled substance. So if you want to keep marijuana testing as part of your testing for now, that's perfectly fine. But it really is up to you. Some businesses don't do it anymore, but your discretion, whatever you feel best with. All right, let's see. Got a couple of things. It looks like somebody said our current application asks these questions that I've said to not ask. It's a super simple fix. You can just draw a black line through them before you give them out to applicants if they're already copied. If they're not copied, if you have a PDF of it, just erase it, black line it, so it's not something that they can fill out. So you want to make sure you take that off as soon as possible. And let's see. Okay, is there an issue if you don't do background checks on everyone, only certain possible candidates? Can be an issue. So this is where I would recommend you want to take a look at by position, because again, in California, being consistent keeps you safe. So if you test everybody who's applying for a CFO position, if you do a background check on everybody that you're hiring for any sort of position that has fiduciary responsibility, that is much safer. If you start picking and choosing who you do background checks on, it's not based on jobs, it's just kind of based on who we think needs a background check. That could get you into hot water because I imagine somebody could try to claim some sort of discriminatory act. So be cautious with that one. Government contractors can still be tested based on federal law. Yes, always default to anything that falls under federal guidelines and regulations. And let's see, we asked for proof of insurance and a copy of the current DMV driver record only for an applicant selected for an interview when position is a driving position. Is that okay? I would be cautious with that. It should be, if there's a cost that's incurred, I wouldn't pass that on to the employee. If you, the employer, are asking for that, I would recommend that you pay for the cost if there is a cost to get that DMV record. So I'd be cautious with that one. All right, great questions, everybody. Thanks. All right, let's keep plugging along. All right, follow consistent onboarding procedures. We're going to talk about, I've got 2 slides that will show you all of the forms that you need, but here's what you want to remember. Everybody should get the same new hire packet. They get all the same forms. Everybody gets the handbook. Everyone can or cannot do direct deposit. Remember, you can't require that in California. It's an option. You want to make sure everybody gets the same trainings. And all of that time, they're on the clock. So you can't say to somebody, hey, come in for half a day on Friday, and then you're going to officially start on Monday. Anytime you are directing an individual to do anything for the company, that is compensable time. So make sure when they come in to fill out the paperwork, that is their first day that they are an employee. Now, when it comes time to train somebody in California, you are allowed to pay a training rate. As long as that is minimum wage, you can do that. So you can say, you know, for your first 2 days, those are going to be training days. We're going to pay you minimum wage for those days. If you want to do that, you can, but you do have to let the applicant know about that beforehand, and then let them know when their rate will go up to their regular rate. Again, notify them before, let them know when that pay will change, but you are allowed to do that in California. All right, here are the required forms. There's a lot. It takes 2 slides, everybody. But you want to make sure every employee is getting the forms. It's not just the I-9 and the W-4. We have to make sure everybody's getting these forms. I'm just showing you here on the slide because we have a link on our website to a new hire checklist that you are able to just download, and it has links to the vast majority of these forms. So when we're done with our webinar, just visit employers.org. Go to HR Answers, click on HR Forms, put in new hire, and that will bring up a new hire checklist for you. If you would like to get an entire new hire packet where all of these forms are already in a PDF for you, just visit our CEA store and you can click and order it right there. It's a screaming deal because everything is updated and ready for you. You just buy that, click print, and you have every form that you need for California. All right, so let's talk about onboarding and orientations. So important to really set a very positive tone for your new employees. You've gone through so much work and effort to find these people and hire them. We want to make sure we've got a good fit. So welcome them to the organization, set them up with a buddy, talk about how they're going to be reviewed. We always recommend 30, 60, 90-day reviews, especially for that initial time because it's so overwhelming. I mean, we all remember starting a new job, but the first few weeks you're just, you know, deer in a headlight. So we want to make sure we're checking in with the employee, that they have the information, that they have the tools that they need. And this is where you really want to work with your supervisor. Make sure that they know everybody should have the same onboarding experience, because we want to make sure, again, everybody's taken care of and we're setting everybody up for a really successful work relationship. All right, I'm going to cruise through. I really just included these for your information. We've talked about some of these already, but I just keep getting questions on meal breaks and rest periods and overtime. So I just wanted to throw these in so everybody had them as a handy reference. So remember, in California, we have daily and weekly overtime. Anytime an employee works over 8 hours in a day, or they work 40 straight time hours in a work week, they're getting paid time and a half. Now, if your business operations sometimes require employees to work 7 days in a row, if they work 7 days in a row in the same work week, which California defaults to Sunday through Saturday, you can have your own work week if you want, but we'll just go with the state's Sunday through Saturday. So if somebody works Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday is their 7th consecutive day, those first 8 hours are automatically overtime. Even if they've only worked a couple of hours every other day, anytime that they work on that 7th consecutive day in the same work week, automatically overtime. Now, there's also double time in California. Anytime an individual works more than 12 hours in a workday, that's double time. And then again, if they're working the 7th consecutive day in the same work week, anything over 8 hours is paid at double time. So why it's so important for you to define your workday and your work week? Again, the state defaults to Sunday through Saturday for a work week, but you can pick another work week. It does need to be 7 consecutive days that starts and ends on the same day. Now, your workday is a 24-hour period. A workday is not that we're open from 8 to 5. A workday is midnight to 11:59. Again, you can set another workday if you want to. We just default to the state midnight to 11:59. But why it's important to have a work day and a work week is because everything resets. Every work day, everything resets, and every work week, everything resets. So Sunday at midnight, that work week resets. So that's why you've got to make sure you're watching your employees' hours, because they might work 7 consecutive days, but if it's over 2 different work weeks, you're not necessarily paying them overtime because they're working in 2 separate work weeks. So take a look and just make sure you're following along those practices, or give us a call on the hotline if you have more questions on that. Now, there's something called the regular rate of pay in California. So we have the minimum wage or the base hourly wage, but then there's also the regular rate of pay. So when you have your base hourly wage, that's what you're getting for every hour worked. Let's say you're paying your employees minimum wage, $15.50 an hour. But if you pay your employees other forms of compensation, if they get commissions, if they get shift differentials, if there's a retroactive pay increase, and again, these are for our non-exempt hourly employees, all those different pay rates go into calculating what's known as the regular rate of pay. And the regular rate of pay is what is used in order to determine overtime. So anytime an employee is getting extra compensation, let's say they got a bonus this week, a non-discretionary bonus based on production, and they've got their regular rate, they got a bonus, and then we gave everybody a special shift differential for the week because they worked a couple of extra hours. All of those different rates of pay go into calculating the regular rate of pay. So that's why you've got to make sure, and this is an opportunity to check your payroll system, check in with your bookkeeper to make sure if employees are receiving different forms of payment, that they're being paid overtime at that regular rate of pay. And that's why it's so important that we also encourage you, don't complicate the regular rate of pay if you don't need to. If you can just maybe bump up your employees' base rate of pay and not have to worry about piece rate or commissions or anything along those lines, sometimes a little easier to manage that pay rate in California. So take a look at that. Give us a call on the hotline if you have more questions. But this is where we just encourage you, check in with your payroll provider. A lot of times out-of-state payroll providers get a little thrown off by some of California's guidelines. So we want to make sure we're always being compliant with California and what we require. But give us a call if you have questions on overtime and the regular rate of pay, and we'll talk you through all that. All right, couple of more slides for us here. Rest breaks. Here is your cheat sheet on rest breaks. What I want to remind everybody about is the DLSE now says an employer cannot require an employee to stay on site for a rest break. So if you have that language in your handbook, you want to get rid of it. So update your handbook, which we always recommend you update your handbook every year. Give us a call if you need some help with that. But remove any language that says employees are required to stay on site during rest breaks. Remember that rest break, it needs to be 10 minutes, 10 net minutes. And if somebody is working less than 3.5 hours, they don't need a rest break. You can certainly give them one. If they work between 3.5 and 6 hours, they get 1 rest break. Between 6 and 10, they get 2 rest breaks, and so on. But make sure, remember, employees can leave. Rest breaks are paid time. Make sure they've got that 10 minutes, so they're getting that rest break. When it comes to meal breaks, an employee needs to have a minimum 30-minute meal break if they're working more than 5 hours in a day. And the other trick with meal breaks is they need to start that meal period before the employee has completed their 5th hour of work. And I'll show you an example of what that looks like. But what that translates into, when somebody is working, by the time they've worked 4 hours and 59 minutes, they should be clocked out for that meal break. Now, if somebody is only working 6 hours, if 6 hours will complete their day, then by mutual agreement, you two can waive that meal period if you want to do that. But you want to have that in writing, and you want to have that in their personnel file. And remember, if they work anything over, if they're supposed to work 6 hours, but they work 6 hours and 10 minutes or 6 hours and 15 minutes, then you didn't provide them with a meal period they were entitled to. And California requires you to pay them 1 hour of pay anytime they miss a meal break or anytime they are denied a rest break or if they don't get a full break. So be cautious with that. So here's an example for that meal period. Somebody starts at 8 a.m. By 12:59, they should be clocked out for that meal period. And again, if you don't provide a meal period, if it's late, if it's interrupted, if they don't get a full 30 minutes, then you're looking at 1 hour of premium pay. So be careful with that. Premium pay is considered wages in California, so that needs to be shown on pay stubs or reflected on the pay stubs in some way. And be really cautious with this because we're seeing a lot of employers that are kind of getting caught up in this. Employees can go to the labor commissioner to file a claim to say, I didn't get my meal breaks, I didn't get my premium pay, and my meal breaks were short all the time. So this is just your reminder, because especially as you're doing new hires and we're bringing on more hourly employees or people are being transitioned back to hourly employees, you really want to watch those meal periods, make sure it's a minimum 30 minutes, make sure they're getting their rest break. You know, they get, if it's an 8-hour day, they get 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon. They're both 10 minutes. So we're making sure our employees are getting everything that they are entitled to. All right, just to wrap it up, and I see I've got a couple questions, so I'll pop up to those here in just a second. So when it comes time to hiring right, really take a look, figure out what you need, make sure you take your time. You know, we always say hire slow, fire fast. So when it comes time, hire slow, take your time, look at those resumes, look at those applications, do a good interview process. I mean, you do have to be timely because it's a tight market out there, but don't make the mistake of just hiring somebody because you need a warm body at the workplace, because that often doesn't work out for you. So do a little due diligence, do your best to make sure you're bringing in the best candidate. Really set up for a very positive, healthy onboarding process. Again, make sure you're being consistent. Everybody hears the same message. Everybody gets the same forms. They get the same handbook. So you can make sure everybody knows that they are part of this group. And it just really does set people up for success. And then, of course, make sure we start everybody out on the right foot. Follow along with those wage and hour guidelines I was mentioning, because you really do want to make sure you're paying your employees properly, because there's a lot of competition out there. And if you aren't following the rules, they will probably find someone who is, and go with that. Let's see. I purchased the new hire packet last year, 2022. Have there been any updates? Yes, there have probably been several updates. That's why we recommend it's not a bad idea to order the new packet. There's always revision dates on the forms, so you can take a look and see with the revision date if it's out of date. But my guess is it would probably be easier for you to just download the 2023 forms, because there have been some changes. Specifically, the Department of Fair Employment Housing is now known as the Department of Civil Rights. So all of their forms have been rebranded. So probably best practice just to get a new one. And great question. Can a meal break begin at the 3rd hour of work? Yes, it can. So there are not guidelines as to when a meal break has to begin. There are just guidelines as to, there are guidelines that it can't go past 4 hours and 59 minutes. But yes, if you need to give a meal break to someone after they've worked for 3 hours, that's perfectly fine. You could give someone a meal break when they've been there for an hour if you want to, if that's something you need to do for your shift and for your employees. So yes, you do have flexibility as to when that meal break begins, but you just want to make sure employees are taking that meal break before they've completed that 5th hour of work, or 4 hours and 59 minutes. All right, great. And let me bring up just really quick, I know we've got a bunch of CEA members on the call, but if you are just with the hotline and if you think, gosh, I need some more help, or I want to get all of these forms, we've got membership options for you. So we have a monthly membership now, which is a screaming deal. It's $99 a month. That'll give you full access to the website. If you think, gosh, I want someone to do a customized handbook for me, then maybe the Premier or the Ultimate membership might be more what you need. But give us a call. We'll be happy to put you in touch with someone from our services team that can talk with you what might work best for your organization. And then let me give everybody the codes here before I turn it back over to Steph. Your codes for today, if you are getting HR credit, it is for HRCI, it's 616304, and the SHRM is 23-TCFYR. And then we had one more question pop in, Steph, sorry. Can an employer mandate an employee work overtime? You betcha you can. You absolutely can tell your employees you're required to work overtime. Of course, I would recommend you do that with grace and understanding that they have other obligations and maybe give them as much notice as possible. But yes, an employer can require an employee work overtime if you need to. All right, Steph, back to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Mary. That was a lot of great information in there. You guys have a copy of these slides as your handouts. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to give your hotline a call. We are standing by with Mary and other people like Mary that are subject matter experts on this, here to help you out all the way through. We've had a couple questions about the recordings for this. We are recording this presentation. I would reach out to the Central Valley Hotline or your local Workforce Development Board who is sponsoring the hotline to find out where you can access that recording at a later date. And thank you again for joining us today and spending your lunch break with us. When the survey pops up at the end of this presentation, please fill it out, give us your feedback, let us know what we can do to improve these going forward. And please have a wonderful rest of your day.